All right, so welcome everybody to the decision making and problem solving breakout session for the Leadership Summit. My name is Michelle Rauch. I'm the Assistant Director in Student Accountability and Restorative Practices.
And hi, I'm Michael Youngborg. I'm the Associate Director in SARP.
So for our session today, we are going to be going over a couple of different things as it relates to decision making and problem solving. We're going to be giving you a lot of information, some different tools and resources that you can use with your student organization. So we're going to be going over affective statements, what they are, how to use them, when to use them. Fair process and inclusive decision making. We're going to talk about what that is and how you can do that. We'll talk about what we refer to as restorative questions, and we'll have a little bit of an overview of what each of those questions are. And then these last two things here, responsive circles and problem solving circles, we'll go over what they are, when to do them, how to do them, and some examples of what those might be. And then at the end, we'll maybe do kind of a share out. So as we're going through today's presentation, just kind of be thinking about, how could you utilize these things with your student organization? Because at the end, we're going to have a little bit of a discussion about that.
Awesome. Sounds good. So I'm going to start us off by talking about affective statements and inclusive decision-making. If you were with us for the last round in the previous session, I'm going to go through this a little bit more quickly, but I still want to make sure that we cover everything. But essentially, affective statements are a sort of base level way of like, hey, how can I talk to someone else? How can I respond to something or express how I'm feeling? You may also be familiar with this in the concept of an I statement, right? Like you're speaking for yourself and only for yourself. These things honestly are useful in everyday life for expressing how you feel, what you might need from someone. And so again, it's a tool that we're talking about utilizing in decision making and problem solving, but is something that really you can look to use much more often, just as a way to frame your thoughts, frame your way of thinking, and ask for what you need as well. It's also a way ultimately to be less judgmental, right? Like you're not assuming or implying something about the other person or persons you may be speaking with when you're using affective statements. You're presenting how you feel and your sort of observation on a situation. And ultimately, we talked about this already, this idea of feelings, right? Being open with your feelings, acknowledging that emotion and how you feel and how you react is a valid part of this experience and is contributing overall to, the structure of what's happening next. So I want to talk a little bit about like, how do you actually do this, right? Like it's useful to express how you feel. It's useful to ask for what you need, but how do you actually structure this and when might you use it? And so the way that we look at this is basically in 4 different parts, right? So a very, very complicated sentence, not really, but ultimately the 4 pieces you're going to look to do are to first make an observation, right? And again, this is where you sort of want to be free of judgment, labels, opinions. You want to see and recognize the other person that you're speaking with. So these kind of examples at the start, the I see, I notice, I hear, right? What is it that you're observing, right? Not why did that happen, but what is it that happened? And describe that as you understand it. Again, starting with that I see. You're not saying, you're not starting with like, well, you did this. You're right. Like you're observing or you are noticing or hearing that something has happened. The next thing, again, is that core piece of it, expressing your feelings. And so hopefully having an empathetic response to others, honestly expressing your feelings. The examples that I have up here are a little bit more on possibly the negative side, that I'm worried or I feel frustrated, I feel disappointed. But it can be a positive reaction. You can feel happy, you can feel proud, you can feel curious, you can feel interested, right? Like it doesn't matter where on that spectrum of feelings you are, this is a way for you to express those feelings. And really it is about expressing your feelings, but it's also about taking it a step further. And so these last 2 parts, the needs and the plans and requests. So the needs are really expressing what is it that you need from this situation, right? Like the examples here, I value cooperation, I need your help, I value fairness. So you're taking that feeling, that observation, that feeling, and now you're translating it into something actionable. So that plan and request piece, finally at the end, you're asking, in the future, or would you be willing to, right? So you're essentially being able to say like, hey, I've seen that this has happened. This is how I feel. And in the future, expressing what you need or what you plan to happen next. And so this is allowing a couple things, right? If you're engaging and using affective statements yourself, you're being open and honest with your feelings. You're being open and honest with what you need or what you expect for how you might want or need to move forward. And then you're also allowing the other person that space as well, right? This is not a one-way street, right? Like you're not making this statement and sort of walking away. You're making this also in the attempt to, again, express some form of empathy and allow the other person or the other people that are involved to give that back to you as well, right? And so a big part of the statement is also the reverse, the listening piece. We're going to talk a little bit more, obviously, about doing that in the process of actually holding a circle, right? But when we think about this as actually a tool in decision making or problem solving, if you are encountering a particularly difficult decision or a problem has arisen, and maybe it's not like an interpersonal conflict, but like, I don't know, maybe it's like a budget shortfall or something like that, right? Like, how do you feel about that, right? Like you notice that there's been an issue with funding or whatever. How does that make everyone feel? Just being able to be open and honest. Like, are you concerned? Are you worried? Are you apprehensive? Does it feel like it is a big problem? And then what do you all need from that? And how do you plan for that going forward? And so really even just utilizing those affective statements as a tool to communicate in the circles we're going to talk about later are a way for you to hopefully frame and express your feelings in a productive way and in a way that's going to allow you to be a little bit more open as well. And when we talk about being open and being honest and how do you feel, we have here what we have as a presentation of what we just call a feelings wheel, right? Very, very kind of simple graphic. But when you think about this, we have this sort of inner circle, the happy, surprised, bad, fearful, angry, disgusted, sad. These are what we would consider sort of your primary responses, your primary emotions. So this is sort of maybe this baseline of like, okay, what is my immediate feeling? And then when we move into these secondary and tertiary layers, it sort of lets you move into the next sort of thing. It's like, okay, I feel surprised. Are you excited? Are you confused? What does that mean? And so then just drilling down further. And so this is honestly something that you could even use in terms of let's say you're having a meeting about making some sort of decision and you just want to open with like a one word thing of like, hey, how is everyone feeling right now? You can condense that statement into a singular word, and you don't just have to use these words, but this is a good starting point for you to maybe hone in on what's your reaction to something and how are you feeling in the moment, and are you able to just express that in a word where you feel astonished or maybe you feel sleepy, or maybe you feel overwhelmed, or maybe you're curious. And then even just introducing that as a singular word then lets you sort of move into expanding on that. So it's like, let's talk about that more. And again, you're not just expressing how you feel, but you're taking that observation, you're taking that feeling, and then you're expressing a need, right? And then you are finally moving into a plan for how do you actually move forward. And so again, this is something that is going to form sort of a baseline for how you can even approach talking in the first place, whether you're being proactive about something or whether you're responding to something. And so let's move into talking a little bit more intentionally about actually engaging in making those decisions. And so I want to talk a little bit about what we call fair process or inclusive decision making, and a couple things here about what that is and what it isn't. And so when we think about fair process and this idea of you've got something in front of you, whether it's the simple process of setting standards for a meeting, or whether you're planning something that's going to happen, or you're working on the budget for the semester and you need to like make some decisions about where you're going to put those funds, where you're going to put the hours that you have dedicated to programming, all of those things, right? All of these pieces may come into play here. And so as you're thinking through those things, as you're thinking through the budget, as you're thinking through the events, as you're thinking through your campus partners, consider who your stakeholders are. Who should be involved, right? Is it, does it start with the executive board? Is it the executive board plus the general membership? Is it that group plus your major campus partners? Who all is involved here that might need to be involved in making those decisions in the first place? And the thing here that we have asterisks, bolded, all sorts of things that we want you to kind of take away from this is it's involving them in co-creating the decision-making process. And also in that being able to clarify roles and decision-making. And before I really jump into that, I want to make sure that it's clear that it's not that you're abdicating your authority to make a decision, especially if you are an executive board member, and it's not necessarily turning everything into a popular vote or like true democracy, right? Because there's this understanding that, hey, if you're thinking about the budget, you only have so much money. You have what you have to work with. That piece of it can't necessarily change. It's important to acknowledge how we feel about that and to start to talk about what we want to do with what we have. But there's only so much room you're going to have in the first place. So, you're not going to be able to necessarily do everything it is that you want to do, but what can you do? And also just making sure that within that, you're leaving space to acknowledge how people are feeling about that. Being transparent about it as well is really important. Being able to move into these next components, right? So transparency is something that's threaded through all of these. But just to take a step back, again, thinking about those stakeholders, that first component here we're talking about is engagement. So you want to make sure that you're involving people in decisions that affect them. You want to listen to your views, genuinely taking their opinions into account. Again, that doesn't mean you're going to let it come down to a popular vote, but you are going to hear people out, make sure that they're heard, and that you actually fully consider all of those viewpoints before you land on that final decision. And then as you're moving through things, as you're actually coming to those decisions and moving to your next steps, explanation, right? You want to be able to describe your reasoning behind a decision to everyone who has been involved or who is affected by it. And again, just to emphasize transparency here, when you're going through that explanation, truly explain, be open about that process. And if you've already involved and engaged your stakeholders from the get-go, you've allowed them to share their viewpoints, to give their feedback on where they think things should be headed. Hopefully this is an easy step, right? To then take that and sort of just move it forward and say like, okay, this is where we've been and this is where we're going, and explaining that pathway for them. And then finally, expectation clarity, ensuring that everyone understands the decision and what is expected of them in the future. So you're not just handing down a decision and saying like, this is how it is. You're not just handing down a decision and explaining the process behind it. You're then talking about what are the next steps and how are we actually going to move forward with that decision. So ensuring that folks understand where they sit in relation to what's happened. If we're talking about, planning an event, for example, does everyone understand what their role is? Somebody doing like social media marketing? Is someone creating posters? Who's hosting the event? Who's going to be like at the door to like greet people? Who's like putting in the room request so we have the space, right? So it's not just a matter of deciding like, yep, we have X amount of money, we're going to do 3 events, here's when they're going to be. Great. There's so many pieces to that, and it's going to get you a lot more buy-in. It's going to be a lot more inclusive, and ultimately, the idea here is to make things run a lot smoother if you're able to engage, explain, and set expectations with all of the folks who are involved, everyone who's a stakeholder, so that everyone understands, at the end of the day, why is something happening the way that it is? And so even if it's not necessarily a decision that everyone agrees with on the surface, they can at least understand the process and the steps that you took to get there, and hopefully ultimately feel like they've had a voice in arriving at that point and know that they will be heard in the future if there are any issues or perceived issues with what's been going on. And so as we talk about these tools, these affective statements, this way of engaging in inclusive decision-making, there are a lot of ways that you can do this. You can do this, like we talked about, to respond to something. You can do this to be proactive about something. And so whether there has been an issue or you're anticipating something happening, it's a tool that you can use. And there are models we have for you to be able to engage in that and actually do it. And we're going to talk a little bit about those examples now, those different types of circles. So I will pass it over to Michelle next to first talk about one of our other tools and then talk about one of the types of circle.
All right. So whenever a decision is made or a conflict arises, and everybody needs to talk about how to resolve the conflict or move through the decision, there are 5 questions essentially that are at the core of every conversation that we have in these circle processes, and they're what we refer to as restorative questions. So the first one being what happened. What happened from each person's point of view? What do they remember that situation being like that caused the conflict? What were they experiencing in that moment? Just plain and simple, what happened in this situation? What were you thinking about at the time? What was going through that person's mind when they chose to not show up for the big event of the semester? Or what were they thinking about when they got really upset at one of the organization meetings. What were they thinking about? What were they experiencing? What have they thought about since? There may be some time from when the conflict happened to when the restorative circle is happening. So in that amount of time, what have they been thinking about? Have they been thinking about anything related to the conflict? Have they been thinking about other things? Have they been thinking about the impact that this has had? And that kind of leads me into who has been affected by what this person has done and in what way. So, in situations involving conflict, somebody's going to be affected by it. Somebody's going to be affected by a decision that was made. Somebody's going to be affected by something that was done. So who was affected by that, and how were they affected? Is the person who is what we would refer to as the harming party, the person who has caused harm or contributed to some type of conflict, are they able to identify, how they've impacted other individuals, and who they've impacted? And then what do you think needs to happen to make things right? So, we're not just in these conversations and in these discussions, we're not just looking at what happened in the past, but we're also trying to figure out, how do we move forward through this? How do we move through this conversation? How do we resolve the conflict? And essentially what needs to happen moving forward to make sure that the harm is repaired and to make sure that further harm has not been done. Now, in these 5 questions, the one thing that you won't see here is why. And we don't really try, we try to avoid asking why something happened, why somebody did what they did, because that could cause them to be a little bit more defensive. It could cause them to feel like they're being attacked, and kind of withdraw a little bit from the situation, or try to deflect responsibility onto somebody else. So we try to avoid that as much as possible, and instead ask these 5 questions here, because these 5 questions help us get to the core of somebody's thought process. What was the experience like for them? It helps us to be able to kind of put ourselves in their shoes, for kind of maybe a little bit of lack of a better term, but to fully understand what was going on for them, and what needs to happen from their point of view, rather than saying like, well, why did you do this thing? Sometimes they may not even know why they did it, but if you're asking them what happened, what they were thinking about, you're able to kind of put the pieces together. So these questions are used in responsive circles. And we've been mentioning this, throughout the course of our time today, but what exactly is it? So a responsive circle is performed after the incident has occurred. So 2 examples of this would be a conflict circle and a healing circle. And I'll talk about what each of those are in just a second. But the restorative questions are used in these circles so that each person's point of view is heard, and then the group works together to come to an agreement to resolve the conflict and move forward from the incident. At its core, that's what a responsive circle is. So when do we do these things? When is it appropriate to do a responsive circle? It can be done in a couple of different situations. If there's a conflict that has occurred between 2 or more members of your organization, and that conflict needs to be addressed and resolved, after something has gone wrong related to an event or planning process, maybe you are planning a really big program, and somebody forgot to do something or bring something, and it really caused a disruption to the event itself. Now, is that something that needs to be addressed and talked about? So this could be a really good way to kind of have that conversation in a less stressful or accusation-driven environment. Rather, it's kind of more of a cohesive and community-oriented discussion. This can also be done if a decision is made by an external party that has negatively impacted the organization. Maybe something happened with a funding request, and your organization wasn't able to get the funding that it needed for a particular event. That's something that was maybe out of the organization's control, but it still caused some type of impact to the group as a whole. And that's where this healing circle could really come as a benefit to your student organization. So how do we do a responsive circle in situations that involve conflict? So you want to identify a facilitator for the circle. The facilitator should be a neutral party, should not be anybody who is directly involved in the conflict. You want them to be unbiased as possible in this situation. And sometimes that could mean that it is somebody who is not part of your organization facilitating the discussion, just so that way, everybody who was involved or impacted by the incident is able to fairly participate in that conversation. The facilitator is going to want to decide on what questions or talking points that should be asked. Some questions can be added to the restorative questions that I mentioned previously, but those restorative questions should always be used in every responsive circle. You can add on things that are specific to the incident that maybe aren't covered under the restorative questions. They may be modified a little bit, maybe multiple things happened during a situation. So it's what happened at this point, what happened at this point. And then identify a talking piece. So a talking piece is anything that can be passed around in a group. So I have, I'm holding up this little like foam person. I'm not sure if you can see it with the screen share, but I think Michael's going to stop sharing his screen. So this little foam thing here can be easily passed around a circle. That signifies that the person who is holding it is the person who is responding to a question. That also means that anybody who is not holding the talking piece is just listening to what that person is sharing. It means that they're not interrupting, because everybody in a circle will have the opportunity to hold the talking piece and respond to a certain question. So the participants will sit in a circle. Sometimes these are done on Zoom. Sometimes Zoom is the way that it has to be done if everybody is not necessarily present, but doing them in person is the most ideal preferred method for facilitating this type of conversation. So the participants are going to be sitting in a circle. The facilitator asks one question at a time, passes the talking piece around for each member to have the opportunity to respond. Once all of the questions are answered, no one has anything left that they want to share, then we move into this agreement portion of the circle. So the agreement is kind of that last talking point in the restorative questions. So it's the, what do you think needs to happen to make things right? So each participant is going to share what they think needs to happen. And all individuals must agree to the terms. So people are going to be coming with different ideas of what they think that they need to do, or what needs to happen to make things right. And so it's always important, that everybody is open to outcomes that maybe don't fit their idea of what should take place. Once everybody agrees to the terms, the circle concludes at that point. Now, I will say that, creating an agreement isn't always a smooth, clear-cut path to resolving a conflict. Some people may be like, hey, you know what? I'm not necessarily sure if I need to do that thing, or I need to do it in that way. So be prepared to kind of engage in a dialogue. It may be a little bit of a back and forth of being like, okay, talk to me about what you think needs to happen, or what is making you maybe a little bit hesitant to agree to these things, to be able to really understand what is holding them up from saying, yes, I will do that, or yes, that is something that needs to happen. Try to figure out, is there anything that can be done to kind of make sure that each point of the agreement is abided by. Sometimes these conversations aren't able to be resolved at one time. Sometimes, you may need to take a break and come back to the discussion after the fact. Restorative practices can be a little bit of a lengthy process to be able to address the conflict, but going through and resolving conflict in this way does create a lot of buy-in, because every individual has the opportunity to be heard and understood, and have some type of say and power to be able to say, yes, this is what needs to happen, and I'm saying that I will agree to do this. So that's how you can do a conflict responsive circle. So there's also another type of responsive circle, which is for healing. So again, this is, maybe something happened, some type of conflict happened either externally or within the group, and the conflict doesn't need to be resolved at this point, but now we're needing to move forward and heal from something that happened. So again, you're going to identify the facilitator for the circle. Decide what questions or talking points that you may want to ask. So an example could be share one word describing how you're feeling right now. So that could be a really good opportunity for the feelings wheel to be used. Those affective statements to be able to be shared out. You'll want to, again, identify a talking piece and, essentially the same thing. Have participants sit in a circle. The facilitator will ask one question at a time, pass it around. Once everybody has answered and no one has anything that they want to share, then again, we're moving into the agreement portion. Now, we're healing in this situation, so it may not necessarily be an agreement of like, what do you think needs to happen to make things right? Because maybe it's kind of out of your control of what happened in this situation, or what that external party decided was going to happen. But the question may shift to, well, where do we go from here? What happens next? So you're instead brainstorming, how do we continue to move forward from this? And what do we as an organization do to continue our goal or mission for what we want to be able to accomplish this semester or do this semester? Again, these healing circles are not necessarily just a one-time thing. You can have multiple healing circles related to one specific situation. The goal is to just continue to be engaged in conversation with one another, build a sense of trust, and utilize that trust to make sure that, hey, we're all invested in this situation. We're all invested in this conflict, in this decision, and moving forward and solving this problem. And we want to be able to, at the end of the day, process this together. Because, as a student organization, we want to have each other's back as we're going through these things that are pretty difficult to try to navigate. So that goes over pretty much all of the content that we have to share today. Before we kind of get into the takeaway. Oh, sorry, Michael, I forgot about the problem solving.
I was gonna say one more thing. No,
there's one more. I lied. There's more.
That's yeah. So I want to talk a little bit about problem solving circles. And I mean, you may look at that like problem solving and being like, didn't we just talk about solving problems with responsive circles, with conflict and healing and whatnot? This is a little bit different. We want to make a distinction with this one because this is more about addressing unexpected issues that would impact the entire group. So it's not necessarily dealing with internal conflict or potential harm that's caused by specific group members, but it is still a way to figure out how to move forward. So I'll go back to that example that I sort of used earlier, which was like, hey, let's say you get to the year and you're like, your budget is just not what you expect it to be. It's not there. You're not going to have the money to do the things that you need to do, right? And so a problem solving circle is something you can use. And again, just starting back with our basic tools of using the affective statements and engaging a fair process throughout the circle, you're going to follow through similar steps that you would have with the other types of circles. You'll identify a facilitator, someone who's going to sort of run the meeting. You're going to sort of figure out in advance, like, hey, what is the issue that we're dealing with? And what are the questions that we might have that we need to talk about? And again, with this, you're not necessarily addressing the, a specific harm by specific people, but you can still talk about the what happened, right? You can still be, and maybe folks have news to share that's transparent about like, hey, this is what I understand to be about, how the budget shortfall came to be. You can talk about how people feel about the situation. What are they thinking in the moment? And how can we move forward, right? And so you're not necessarily going through all of the same restorative questions all the way through. Obviously, you can talk about impact, though, right? Like, how have you all been impacted personally? How have you been impacted as an organization? And that final question is more so how do we move forward in a scenario where we've encountered a problem? What are we going to do to solve this problem, right? And so you want to think through the different types of questions that you might want to ask about that. This may be a more a less structured rather thing where maybe you are sending your talking piece around the circle a couple of times to ask how people are feeling, to get their reactions, their initial read on things that have gone on. But you may also be like, hey, let's popcorn the talking piece around. Who's got some ideas? Who's got some different things? This may be also a scenario where you're not just doing one large circle, but maybe you need to address specific issues. Maybe you need to take that budget and you need to think about outreach, you need to think about programming, you need to think about maybe you have a budget for swag normally, maybe you need to think about all of those things, and maybe you need to divide into like subgroups to talk about this and then come back together as a whole to really think about like what's the broader impact, right? So the problem solving circle can be a little bit sticky, and ultimately you still want to hopefully walk away from that with some kind of agreement. Maybe you won't have specifically solved the problem entirely, but at least talked about a way that you need to move forward. And not just move forward, but remember those affective statements to also allow space for people to talk not just about how they feel, but about what they specifically need. And again, it's not just about the individual, but it's about the group as well as an organization. What do you all need to be able to move forward in the face of a problem that you've encountered? Whether it is something as large as a budget shortfall, or maybe it's something as simple as like, you had a room reservation and it's not the fault of any one person. Nobody forgot to reserve it, but for some reason ECS is like, no, you no longer have that space. You need to find a new one, just unexpectedly. Maybe you need to bring something together that's a little bit more ad hoc. You don't have as much time to plan and think in advance and react to it. It's a more in the moment sort of thing. Maybe a circle in that scenario isn't the best solution. Maybe you need to move a little bit quicker, but you can still engage in some of these tools. Make sure that you're informing the stakeholders. Who are all of the relevant people involved who need to know what's going on, who might be affected, how might they be affected. And so you can use that as an opportunity, even if you're not able to engage specifically in a circle process in the moment, to still kind of walk through those steps of take a moment to breathe, work through the affective statements, think about fair process, identify and engage your stakeholders, talk through an explanation of what might need to happen next, and provide some clarity on expectations for roles and things like that moving forward. So there's a lot of ways that this can go that I think may look like a normal circle a lot of the times, but may also be something that needs to be a little bit more impromptu, may require a little bit more flexibility and more moving on your feet. And I think if you can think of the tools that we've discussed and think of the structure of the circle, what you can accomplish through that, and apply that in a scenario where you're reacting to a problem, whether it's a larger one that you have some more time to sit back and take the time to develop those questions, develop those sort of subgroups and larger group questions that you need to answer, or you're working through something that's a little bit more ad hoc. Hopefully it's something that is at least a little bit more, at least provides you with a framework for how to do that and how to encounter those things when they do pop up. And so, yeah, I just wanted to go over those problem-solving circles real quick. We do want to leave some time for you all to answer some questions, but I see there are a couple of you here. Do either of you feel like you have like maybe one takeaway from what we talked about today that you feel like you will kind of personally take back from this? One thing that stood out to you?
I can go.
Sure.
I liked how it started off with using I statements. I know I've definitely heard that before, but I think it's always something like that's important to like keep centered in these conversations and like not come off as accusatory. Um, and also the wheel of like emotions thing was really interesting to me as well. And how much, diversity there is among just those couple different feelings. And I think that would be like a helpful resource to use.
Mhm.
Yeah, I was actually going to say the same thing about the wheel of emotions. That's something that I've used in therapy before to kind of
Mhm.
describe how I'm feeling. And I think bringing that into a more professional setting in a student work, I think that's an incredible way of kind of describing how you're feeling about a problem and how to move forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's something as simple as, and I think Michelle had brought this up at one point as one of the questions of even using that as like, a little bit of an icebreaker or check in, check out at the beginning and end of when you're doing these things of just be like, hey, like what's a one word of how you're feeling right now? And that's a good starting point for, being able to identify those feelings. And again, moving through like, what's my primary reaction and then drilling down into like, what am I actually feeling? as a reaction to these things. So yeah, do either of you have any specific questions, anything else that you feel like we could elaborate on, talk more on for you?
I have a question. I don't know if it's necessarily related, but well, it kind of is. I don't know maybe if you could answer it, but I know I've discussed with people in my organization about kind of appointing like a grievances officer who could like be in charge of like restorative practices or something should a conflict arise. Do you like, are we able to do that? Like, is there anything saying we can't do that? Or like, is there specific things we would have to follow if we wanted to implement something like that?
Fantastic question. So definitely check with Chris Rindosh, because Chris Rindosh will have a better idea of what you can and can't do within your student organization. I think I speak for both Michael and myself when I say this, but will never say like don't use restorative practices or don't have somebody to do that. It can actually be very helpful to have somebody who is designated to do these types of things, to be able to facilitate these conversations, so long as they can remain unbiased. And if you need assistance in trying to identify maybe how to create that position or how to frame it to your members to try to get them involved in something like that, reach out to our office, and we can kind of work with you to say like, these are the things that may be good to take into consideration, or to this breakout session that we did today is like the crash course of this portion of restorative practices. There's so much more that we can go over and share with you all. So if you're wanting us to kind of come either to your executive board or to just like your general meetings during the semester to be able to talk about restorative practices, to kind of see if anybody would be interested in doing that, we would be happy to share that out and be part of that with you. But yeah, I think that's a great thing to be able to do and have on your board, so that way these conflicts can be addressed and handled through the ways that we shared out today.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And even just kind of brainstorming off of that, like, let's say you talk to Chris and like it's maybe a little bit difficult, like having someone specifically be that person. One thought I would had is just even if you have as one of the responsibilities for one of your existing members of like being a liaison with someone in our office, and then if that sort of outside facilitator is necessary, we can work with you to make that happen. And so, whether it's a formal or informal setup, I mean, Michelle is right. Like, I think we're never going to say no to that. We'll work with you to make that function in the way that makes the most sense for you all, right? So every organization is going to be different too. So people might have different ideas, different expectations, different needs. That's going to be totally fine. We will make sure that we kind of fine tune that thing to whatever it is that you all need.
Okay, thank you.
Do either of
Any
you
other
have any
questions?
other questions? Sorry, Michael.
I don't have any other questions.
Nothing either.
Okay, did you want us to share out the resources that I mentioned? Do you want us to share that with both of you?
Yeah, I can send my email in the chat. Or do I
Okay.
email you?
If you want to just drop your email in the chat, you can send it like personally to me. I'll make a note of them to send out. The only other thing that I wanted to share here is that, like I mentioned, we offer individualized restorative practices training. Like I said, today was really the crash course of how to utilize these types of tools. But if you want something tailored to your specific student organization, we can definitely do that. Just reach out to our office and we will connect with you there. The other thing is that we offer trainings just for student organizations in a general sense, as well as workshops. So be on the lookout for those things that are being offered from our office for this coming spring semester. If anybody has anything else that they want to talk about, or kind of just sounding board, we'll be happy to stick around. Otherwise, we can wrap up maybe just a couple minutes early from our breakout session. Michael, unless you have anything else that you want to add.
Nope, nothing else from me.
All right, well then, thank you for attending for this afternoon. And good luck with the spring semester and have fun with the rest of the summit.
Thank you so much. Have a good
Thank
one.
you.